facilitating today's webinar, along with Jonathan Andrus from CRIO, who will be helping facilitate our Q&A session. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes I would like to cover. I will also provide a brief introduction to Sitero and CRIO, as well as introduce you to our presenters. Please note that we are all presenting from a remote environment and our internet connections might not be as reliable as they usually are in an office setting. In the event of a disruption, please do remain on the line. We will have things back up and running momentarily. Additionally, a recording of the presentation will be available after the conclusion of today's live event. Now, let me introduce you to Sitero and CRIO. Sitero is a next-generation, site-focused clinical research partner that leverages technology to advance the life sciences industry. With expertise in clinical trials, drug safety, biosafety, and IRB review services, Sitero offers a comprehensive solution that not only enhances safety and compliance, but also accelerates clinical trials. CRIO is an industry-leading eClinical solution provider delivering innovative data capture technology for sites, sponsors, and CROs. CRIO's unique architecture enables a single point of data capture that enables quality and transparency at the point of entry and creates significant downstream efficiencies. Today, CRIO supports more than 2,000 medical research sites and nearly 5,000 protocols worldwide. Now, let me briefly introduce you to our presenters. First presenter today is Dakota Rowland, Sitero's Head of Clinical Operations. Dakota has over 10 years of clinical research operations experience at various CROs. And throughout his career, Dakota has focused on maximizing the latest technology to streamline clinical trials, standardize data collection, and improve patient safety. Next, we have Megan Richards, one of CRIO's customer experience managers. Megan has 5 years of clinical eSource operations experience and has been involved in many sponsor-driven eSource studies, as well as countless site-based eSource implementations. And lastly, we have Jonathan Andrus, CRIO's president and COO. Jonathan has 27 years of industry experience and has been involved in all facets of the design, development, and deployment of clinical trial technologies. Jonathan is also engaged in initiatives aimed at improving and streamlining the clinical trial data collection process and frequently interacts with regulatory agencies and health authorities on topics in and around eSource and clinical trial execution. As mentioned earlier, Jonathan will be helping facilitate our Q&A portion of today's webinar. And now I will turn it over to Dakota to get us started.
Thanks, Heather. So the topic of our presentation today is all around eSource, but eSource is a bit of a vague term that's used in the industry in a number of different ways. So in general, source is where a data point is originating. So when we say eSource, it's being correctly applied if that point of origin is in some kind of electronic format. So the term eSource is used pretty heavily within the industry. The focus of this presentation and how we define eSource is really looking at protocol-driven and site-completed data, but there are other forms of data capture that are electronic, which could be considered source. So a couple of them which have been around in the industry for are eCOA or ePro. So this is devices, whether they are provided to patients or patients are using cell phone with an app, that patients are completing these. And while they are a form of eSource, it is not how we are defining eSource for purposes of this presentation. Another area of confusion for a lot of sites and within the industry is when they are thinking of their EMRs or their EHRs. So this is medical records, which of course are included in clinical trials as part of their source. But for EMRs and EHRs, this is really a clinical management tool outside of the scope of clinical trials that is non-study specific. So when we think of eSource, how we're defining this within clinical trials is something that is specific to our protocol, that is a site-facing tool where data is captured electronically in support of a clinical trial. Move to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Megan to talk through some of the pain points of the traditional paper data collection and how these are streamlined with an eSource approach.
Great, thanks, Dakota. So I'm sure some of these points on the screen here are familiar to you at the site level. So as we have a list of common pain points here, if you've experienced issues with poor data quality in general and just not having streamlined data in your systems or on paper, protocol deviations in general, just being overburdened by all of the different systems that you might have to be using and actions that the sponsor is requiring you to take within a given time frame, just trying to hit enrollment targets in general, and also ideally be compensated for pre-screening efforts and tracking those, standing up new sites to support enrollment and diversity targets, especially post-COVID, as increasing diversity in clinical trials in the past couple of years has become more and more on the forefront of our minds here. And then long EDC entry times and just waiting for these data locks from the sponsor and the CRO. So these are common issues for you. We'll discuss a little bit more about how eSource can help solve some of these problems that you might be experiencing at your site. Heather, you can go ahead to the next slide, please. So eSource really allows us to take the protocol, a 200+ page document, and automate it to support your site's workflows and make it just much more readable and easy, even for a newer CRC at your site, perhaps, to be able to go through and perform the data collection and make sure that key pieces of information aren't being missed. So we're able to take, for example, the time and event schedule and turn that into what we have on the right-hand side of the screen, this eSource procedure form, which will contain the procedure instructions. It has all of the data points that need to be collected, and it will include things like alerts and disable logic as well to help streamline those workflows and make sure that we're collecting the correct data. And then it also allows us to build in that visit schedule that we have on the left-hand side with the windows that might be included as well. So it's really making this process a lot easier for the sites, and it's just automating that workflow entirely for them electronically. Next slide, please, Heather. Thanks. So here we have a few of the examples of how eSource is able to actually create the protocol of compliance and build in the quality and these compliance factors up front. So we're building everything into the eSource. So at the point that we're collecting this data, this source data, we're getting these alerts or these disable rules to potentially make changes if needed, so that we're catching issues before weeks down the line, the CRA is monitoring this data and they're pointing out that, the blood pressure is out of range or whatever that might be. So with eSource, we're able to, as I mentioned, build in that visit window and the scheduling directly into that workflow. And we can have alerts if visits are scheduled out of window, for example. We can also track the capturing of the informed consent, whether it's e-consent or still done on paper, but we can track when a consent form needs to be signed at the screening visit and then reconsents down the line to make sure that the subjects are being consented at the appropriate visit when a potential new informed consent might be approved by the IRB. Additionally, we're able to build these workflows in, so we can create site-specific workflows in the eSource. It's not just those protocol-specific stats questions that the DM and statisticians need on the sponsor side down the road, but we're able to add site-specific workflows that might help with site payments from the sponsor, as well as workflows to ensure that the PI is reviewing specific data points and that everything is being captured correctly. So the sites can build in their own processes into their own instance of the eSource so that it works with their internal process. Along with that, we can capture information like progress notes, we can query the data electronically, and we can, as you saw previously, add instructions and clarification text to some of these questions so that as that data is being captured, again, those coordinators, whether they're new to the site or they've had years of research experience, they're clear on what needs to be done so that that data is getting collected properly initially, and it can save a lot of time down the line. So ultimately, we're driving this compliance, and we're also able to ensure that there's increased patient safety because we're, again, building some of these edit checks into the eSource right away. And then, as we'll get to later in the presentation, we're allowing for immediate and continuous remote monitoring of this data as well. Next slide, please. And Dakota, go ahead. Send that back to you.
So building off of what Megan has already told us about how the eSource works, this is how I first became involved with CRIO. Is I was a monitor at site, and I immediately saw the advantages of this site was a career user. They had multiple sites and they were able to streamline their processes, and they were a much higher performing site. It became immediately obvious to me at that time that this was the way of the future and that we were going to see all sites migrate to this form of source data collection. And as advantageous as it was as a site tool, I started to think from the CRO and the sponsor side how we could leverage this technology to be even more efficient in how we monitor. But at that time, it was largely still, to me, an operational efficiency until this point, where in 2016, I was a CRA still at this time. I was at one of the large CROs. It's very common within the industry that CRA turnover is pretty high. It's a big industry-wide issue. And the study I got assigned to did not have a CRA visit this site in 10 months. The study was for an HIV treatment of treatment-naive women. So it was a high safety component to this protocol. And while I was monitoring, I was the first CRA at a particular site, and I saw something quite disturbing. So I was sent to the site in November of 2016, but in February of 2016, which was shortly after the previous monitor had quit, the site had a patient that discontinued IP the day after one of their patient visits due to nausea. So these patients on this trial would come in on a monthly cadence, and this happened the day after the visit occurred. The study was not using an e-diary, so the site was not made aware that the patient had discontinued dosing until the patient showed up for their next visit a month later. And this is particularly concerning for patients on HIV studies because there is a risk of building up a tolerance to the drug if it is not dosed properly. So we did have the concern that potentially this patient was no longer, the treatment would no longer work for this patient. What became particularly concerning as we started to dig into the data for this patient is the patient was not nauseous due to the IP, but instead it was due to the patient being pregnant. So because we were not leveraging the technology that was already available at this time, CRIO had existed for several years, the site was not made aware of this issue until a month later when the patient came in for their visit. And the CRO and the sponsor were not made aware of this issue until 10 months after this issue occurred. So by the time the sponsor was notified that we had a treatment-naive woman not dosing appropriately, at the risk of developing treatment intolerance for herself, and also the potential risk of passing HIV on to her unborn child, the patient's baby had already been born. Fortunately, the story is not as dramatic as it could have been. That patient was able to get back on a stable dose, and the child was born HIV negative. but this story really highlighted to me the necessity of adopting the latest technology, and in particular eSource, not just as an operational tool, but really as a patient safety tool. Because in this instance, we were not even made aware of this issue until the patient's unborn child was ultimately born and unfortunately was HIV negative. But I think this gets lost in understanding just the efficiencies to be gained with leveraging a technology like eSource and the monitoring process, that this isn't just a tool to make our lives simpler. This goes back to patient centricity. And I feel quite passionate about this, that we have a moral obligation to, as researchers, embrace this latest technology to ensure that we are doing the best by our patients. So moving on from that instance, so that was really what highlighted eSource as not just the operational tool, but a huge component in patient safety. So I started to try to work at the large CROs I was at the time to push more remote monitoring, leveraging this technology. And you can see there's a big gap in the timelines there where this story occurred in 2016. And unfortunately, I was unable to convince any of the large CROs to allow us to start doing more of this remote SDV, leveraging the technology until 2020. And the big reason for that is due to COVID. So when COVID first hit, what we were seeing at an operational level is that our CRAs could no longer go on site. Sites did not want to see the CRAs. The CRA lifestyle is that they're traveling through often multiple major airports in a week, going to various doctors' offices. They were basically the last people that sites wanted to see, especially sites treating patients that were immunocompromised. So we still to this day see a lot, in particular oncology, of sites not allowing on-site monitoring. So when COVID first happened and we first had all our CRAs grounded in-house, we were at a bit of a pivotal point in the industry where we have been so dependent up until this point of getting our CRAs on site. It's how CROs bill sponsors for running their trials, that it's a dependency that they did not know how to work without. So once that was removed and we could no longer get our CRAs on site, people were finally open to this new approach to monitoring, which was leveraging the eSource to do remote source data verification. So fortunately, at that time, I reached out to CRIO, and we were lucky that a few of our sites were already eSource users. It's the main eSource platform that is used at the site level within the industry. So we started a small subset just as a test to see, is this something we could really do? Could we do not central monitoring, but full-blown source data verification, leveraging the eSource technology already in use at these sites? And what we found was well beyond even my own expectations, as somebody who's been a proponent of this approach for a long time, and our monitoring efficiency was greatly increased. So we were seeing, once the CRAs were monitoring from the comfort of their own homes with multiple monitors, a 40% increase in their SDV rate, as opposed to the model where we were sending them on site to review the data. At this time in particular, the big highlight here was that it maximized our CRA utilization. It's an industry-wide target for the CRAs that they're usually on site 8 to 10 days a month. But once we removed that dependency of the CRA needing to be on site, and they were no longer losing all this time and ultimately cost to the sponsors in travel, we were able to get a lot more production out of our CRAs, where what we saw was closer to 12 to 16 days on site, which if you're taking from the low to the high range, we were in some instances doubling the productivity of our CRA. We also had greatly improved CRA retention, and this was during a period where CRA turnover had never been higher because of the pandemic and the conditions associated with it. The appeals of a travel job were non-existent. So by switching to this approach of having our team monitor data in the same way they would as if they were on site, but just looking at this eSource remotely, our retention was far greater than even prior to the pandemic, and our efficiency was that much higher. That from a cost perspective, a data quality perspective, and ultimately a patient safety perspective, where this was data that otherwise would have sat unmonitored, issues would have not been detected. We were seeing improvements on virtually every metric. And ultimately on that study, we were still able to meet our interim analysis soft database lock because we were leveraging this technology in eSource and performing more, not just central monitoring, but true remote source data verification. The next slide. And this is Megan's slide, but I do want to introduce this. So this is now what we are using today, where that previous scenario, I was describing this only as a COVID mitigation. But ultimately, once this is embraced at the study-wide level, which is something we do here at Sitero, there's dramatic improvements beyond that we can see with the overall trial management. So I'll let Megan talk through that change in workflow.
Yeah, so as Dakota mentioned, I mean, what we're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen, this 5 steps to the workflow and perhaps even more steps than we have visible here. This is what we're generally used to, where we're capturing the source data on paper or electronically, re-entering or transcribing that data, I suppose, into EDC. So we're doing like dual data entry. And then the CRAs come to do their source data review and the source data verification. And then finally, DM is reviewing the stats data specifically, or the safety data in the EDC. So with this reimagined workflow that we're describing here, what we're able to do is enter the source data electronically, so eSource data capture within an eSource system. And then the important step here is that this allows for centralized and remote monitoring of the data. So as soon as that data is entered in the eSource and that visit is complete, or at least partially completed to the point that the data is collected that day, a monitor would be able to log in and immediately see and review that data. And so this allows them to see if any new AEs were reported right away or protocol deviations. Again, we have that just immediate access to the data. Even on the site side, if an adverse event is reported and the coordinator is entering the data electronically, they're able to immediately inform the PI. So everyone is up to date immediately on the new data entry that's captured in the system with this centralized and remote data monitoring approach that we're able to provide by using an electronic system, such as CRIO here.
If I could just talk on how this new approach changes once sites are adopting it on the CRO and sponsor side as well. So this really reimagines the way that we do monitoring today. So the workflow on the right is the typical approach that we see. Even as the COVID mitigation approach, it was great that we were able to now do the SDV process remotely, but we were still seeing these same inefficiencies in the system where the sites still had to transcribe data from one electronic source into another electronic source. And it's not challenging to understand that once both platforms are electronic, there's really no reason for this transcription process. So what we are able to do today is work towards eliminating the EDC entirely. And there's no reason to have 2 standalone systems that capture a lot of the same information. So what we're doing at Sitero by leveraging CRIO's eSource and their reviewer modules is we are eliminating that EDC. So from a site perspective, the sites just need to go in, complete the visit the same way they always have, and their workload stops. So instead of having to transcribe all that data into a separate system, we're able to just extract the fields that we need for the EDC directly. And instead of having this approach of days on site and looking at a snapshot in time of what's going on at the site level, we are now able to do close to real-time data review. So with it all being electronic, there's no reason to wait for a CRA to get on site to look at a visit. So what this does is it speeds up all the data cleaning timelines. From the site side, it's very often that contracts are contingent on data being verified. So that dependency is removed. Sites can now be paid directly upon completion of the visit, so they're getting paid much more quickly, which makes their operations much more streamlined and easier to manage from a budget perspective, that they're not waiting on a CRO or a sponsor to be able to monitor the data. And from the sponsor side, we now have close to real-time access to this data, where via the CRIO platform, we are able to actually log in, see the site's data as they are completing that visit. So it allows us to provide close to and potentially even real time, if necessary per protocol, review of that data to capture and mitigate issues, as opposed to the retroactive approach that relies on the days on site model, where it could be several months between visits, and by the time issues are identified, like the HIV story I shared, the patient's already come and gone. That issue potentially has been repeated across multiple patients, that the only action we have is to put corrective action in place to try to prevent that issue from reoccurring. But that doesn't benefit the patients that these issues have already occurred to. So by expediting that data review, we're able to provide real value to these patients as they are going through the study, not just having this continually retroactive approach.
Great. So the way that we're able to incorporate these workflows really ties down to how we build this source. So we are used to having the ECRFs, which of course match or come from the protocol. And this is built as our central source. We're actually able within CRIO to build this centrally, version control it, and publish it to our sites. The sites, of course, though, are capturing additional data than just what is in those ECRFs. There are additional workflows that need to be built in so that we can make sure that we're reducing deviations, we're capturing all the data that's needed, and we're really just ensuring protocol compliance ultimately. We need the full set of eSource data to be captured, not just what's in the ECRF. So with this system, we're able to, again, publish the central source documents and then add to those. And each site can actually build upon their own workflows at the site level, so that they're just adding to that template. And then on top of that, with the review of the data remotely, we can designate specific questions as what we call core in CRIO, but this is really the data points that perhaps data management is reviewing, the stats data, and they can filter down to just that data, so that still the site is capturing everything they need to on their end for their workflows to reduce some of those deviations. But then when the data is being reviewed, we can look at all of it or just specific pieces, those specific core questions. So with the eSource, we have here more accurate data. It's a more richer data set, and it's really built for these sites to help with their workflows. That's really the point here, to make this a site forward system. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so ultimately, how this eSource workflow, how this benefits clinical research as a whole, is that we have benefit on the site side and the sponsor CRO side. We are really simplifying the process and allowing sites to build the source to match their specific and perhaps unique workflows. We have these checks to manage and review the visit windows and ensure that all of the visits are being scheduled within window or they're being flagged if not. We can ensure that data is consistent and standardized across all of our sites, and that we have this quality data with those checks that are built in upon that initial eSource data entry. As Dakota mentioned, we can eliminate the data transcription piece by really eliminating the EDC portion. We can have both the monitors and the DM team reviewing the data that they need to see, again, in real time, and query the site if needed also in real time so that the data can get cleaned as quickly as possible. And ultimately, with electronic data for the sites, we're just eliminating that need to maintain large paper binders for many years. Everything can be done electronically and can be archived electronically as well. On the sponsor side or the CRO side, we get that real-time access to the data. So as soon as it's entered into the eSource system and those visits are complete, the CRAs can log right in and they can review that data. Again, they can query, do what they need to communicate with the site. They can just ultimately reduce these monitor costs because we're not flying back and forth to sites constantly. We have this remote SDV capability. And so with utilizing that, there's a reduced need to travel on site. And then ultimately, it gives you the ability to have this true remote monitoring, make this process a bit more efficient, and then be able to speed the process along so that we can move to database lock much more quickly because, again, we're able to review the data right away. You don't have to wait for the sites to enter into EDC and then further wait for that review to go back and forth with the sites. Everything can be done in real time. So there is truly a benefit to utilizing eSource from just the standpoint of speeding the process up, but more importantly of ensuring that patient safety because we can log in and we can review, again, those AEs, the PDs, any of this other data right away, and then perform actions as needed.
And I think from the sponsor and the CRO side, one of the things that's been most exciting to see about CRIO and their eSource platform is that this was a tool that evolved from the site level up, where so often in the industry, the drivers of the new technologies are the sponsors, are the big players with the large budgets. And it's very often the case that we're forcing our technology down onto sites. And it's technology that was not designed with them in mind, where it's what the sponsor wants to see, the end result. But ultimately, it's sites that are doing the work on protocols. That what's been very exciting about CRIO and eSource is that it started just at a single site level, where their founder identified as a site owner that the way we were running clinical trials using paper source was an inefficient way to capture data, just for him as a single site owner. That now with the growth of CRIO becoming a way to standardize data collection across not just one site, but all sites, it now has the ability to roll up into what we're using it today as a CRO and sponsor-facing tool to standardize that data collection, not just at a couple sites, but study-wide, where we are now seeing that data standardization and the efficiencies of being able to work outside of an EDC system, where we're only now putting one technology platform in the hands of sites that was actually designed with them in mind, as opposed to so many of the different platforms, where it's very common on any study that a given site might have 10 different vendors they're working with. And it's extremely challenging to work with that many different systems when none of them were designed with our end user in mind. So what eSource really does from an end-to-end perspective is it creates a true collaborative data collection process. where it's evolved from this simple site tool just to eliminate the paper to now how we're using it industry-wide at a study level, where we are able to roll out a study-specific design of the eSource template. It's been a while, but I remember the days where it used to be standard for sponsors and CROs to provide source templates to sites. I think we've largely gone away from that. But now with eSource, we're able to ensure that that data collection is streamlined, that we're not relying on 100 different coordinators to interpret the protocol and capture their best interpretation of that protocol, to ensure all the data we need for the CSR is captured. But now with eSource, we're able to reduce that burden of site participation by building out these templates for them, where sites still retain ownership of the template. They're still able to customize based on their local or regional needs. But we've taken all these efficiencies that we traditionally have only associated with an EDC, like things like the data validations and edit checks, and instead of them being a retroactive analysis of our data, where typically sites have 5 days to enter source data into an EDC, by the time they see that edit check file that or fire, that patient's long gone, and that data likely will never be captured. So by pulling in those efficiencies and the technology to make it a true site-facing tool, the data management process isn't something that's retroactive. It's something that happens in real time as these sites are seeing these patients. So this is the technology that and the approach that we've really embraced here at Sitero, and it's dependent solely on what we're able to do via the CRIO platform, where it's transforming the way we do monitoring. And what we're building towards is eliminating this concept of interim analysis, because we're able to clean data in real time, where instead of a sponsor potentially needing to wait a year to even start to analyze their data, even on an interim basis, we're now able to streamline that data collection to cleaning timeline to take it down from potentially years to days. And that's been very impactful. It's very critical to clients as they manage their trials. And most importantly, that data cleaning process all goes back to ensuring we're following the protocol correctly, which ultimately determines if we are protecting patients as best as possible. So it's very unique story, in my opinion, that it started with the end users in mind and has since evolved now to be all-encompassing as an end-to-end collaboration tool, where even if we have potential safety issues identified, the traditional process relies on a lot of back and forth, a lot of retroactive views, where now we're able to give our medical monitors and our sponsors direct access to this source data. So there's no back and forth, there's no interpretation. It's direct access to the information we need, not just to ensure protocol and data compliance, but most importantly, ensuring patient safety as well.
Actually, Dakota, I have a question that came in.
Okay.
Actually, Dakota and Megan. A question about, been hearing a lot about the fact we can do remote SDV, you can do remote source data review and really bring the data instantly, right? All the importance of patient safety, patient oversight, some of the things you were talking about during your case study. But I guess what are some of the other things that can be done, I guess, in lieu of, or other activities that could be done that, I think based on the question, right, really bring much more intrinsic value to the clinical research process that are afforded because you're able to do a lot of these things remotely. So I know you mentioned about days on site and all those other things, but I guess in light of like the HIV example and in light of some of the things you were even talking about here, tools like CRIO and being able to do that remote review, what does that afford a monitor to be able to do while they're on site? Like if the number of days on site are now a bit more limited because you're able to do things more remotely. What does that free up, you know, a CRA or a monitor to be able to do while they're on site physically, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a big part of how we're enabling this technology here at Sitero, is because we're now able to remove this dependency of being on site to do SDV. It frees up our CRAs to spend a lot more time on site focusing on other things. So traditionally for a CRA, 6 of their 8 hours on a day on site is going to be focused at looking at what's on paper and ensuring that it's the same set of data that's in the EDC. And this isn't a high value add of their time. So instead, how we're able to refocus our CRAs during these visits is they can spend the time actually speaking with the sites, understanding what their processes are to help bring our expertise to improve those processes and work through issues they're seeing, not at the protocol level, but as a system and as an institution. So this goes to identifying potential patients, increasing awareness of efforts that can be done to promote diversity within the industry, or sorry, within the trial recruitment, and build those relationships with the sites to understand what their issues are, so we can then roll up that feedback and provide it at a study-wide level to ensure that our sites are being adequately supported on a trial, and that then we can share those best practices with all sites. So it really allows our CRAs to focus on much broader issues instead of just looking at a piece of paper and ensuring the data entered is consistent.
Oh, great. I don't know, Megan, if you have any perspective from some of the customers that you've had over the years of your time at CRIO interacting with, that, you know, what are some of the benefits that they have seen in light of being able to have more time to do some of the things even that Dakota just talked about, of having more of that personal interaction and relationship and developing and training?
Sure. Yeah, no, I would certainly echo what Dakota said, but I think this does help to really put the sites first. They're the ones they're doing the data collection and really conducting these trials. They're necessary part of this process. And I think, you know, from a lot of speaking to clients and things, a lot of times they feel that their voices aren't really heard when it comes to getting their needs met by the CRAs and the sponsors. And so if they are able, the CRAs are able to spend more time now away from this SDV and really understanding the site process and how we can improve this process moving forward, that's really beneficial.
Great, thank you. Sorry to throw a question.
No worries.
I think we're at the final slide here, then we can open it up to the floor for additional questions. But just to wrap up the presentation specifically, I'm happy to stay on and continue to talk through specific challenges and questions our participants have. But for eSource and how we're now seeing it implemented today, COVID was really a major catalyst, where the industry approach was always this eSource technology. It sounds interesting. It sounds like it's something we could look at in the future. But COVID as a catalyst really highlighted that this is not something that's nice to have on the roadmap for sponsors and CROs. This is something that we should have done 5-10 years ago, and the technology's been out there. And now that we've had the opportunity to use it as a COVID mitigation, and we have that strong proof that this is a much more efficient way to do SDV, we are now seeing greater adoption, but acceptance is still somewhat limited to fully embracing the ultimate power of this technology to do remote source data verification. So, you know, I talked about it a bit during the presentation, that what's very unique is that eSource has matured as a tool, where it's no longer a site-facing tool. It's not even something that just enables source data verification remotely, but it has matured into a true end-to-end data collection and, most importantly, data evaluation tool. because it has evolved in this more collaborative end-to-end solution, it's no longer just a tool that's very beneficial for sites, but benefits all stakeholders, most importantly, patients involved in the clinical research process. So just as a final note, because again, I think this is not talked about enough when we think of eSource and technology, but the focal point of all this isn't just reducing timelines, being more efficient, reducing cost. It's really the focus point for me is that technology improves patient safety and the ability to resolve issues in real time as opposed to weeks, months, and in some instances, years later can truly make a life-saving impact for our patients.
All right. I just wanted to hop back on and thank you, Dakota and Megan, for your presentation and sharing your experiences with how eSource technology is really improving patient safety, data quality, and overall trial execution. So at this time, we'll be moving into the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you do have any questions for Dakota or Megan, please type them into the Q&A feature. It should be at the top of your screen. If you have issues accessing or viewing the Q&A feature, which can be on some devices or internet types, please feel free to use the regular chat feature, and we're going to try our best to get to all of our questions today during the live event. So I will now pass it back over to Jonathan, who will kick us off with our next question from the audience.
Great, thank you, Heather. I was actually going to say, here's a maybe a slight curveball, but it'll be a test, Dakota and Megan, to see if you actually have read in its entirety the latest draft DCT guidance that just came out in May. So we'll see. But anyway, the question is about how can companies, in the draft FDA decentralized clinical trials guidance document, it talks about the fact that different types or different modalities of clinical research sites can be used in a given clinical trial. So for example, the DCT guidance talks about in there the use of healthcare professionals, the use of remote monitoring or remote nursing visits at patients' home, the use of brick and mortar research sites. So kind of a variety of flavors in a single clinical trial. And so this question's about how do you go about managing a hybrid approach to clinical trial execution like that when a site, a study might be made up of both home-based nursing, brick and mortar sites, maybe a local healthcare professional thrown in there for good measure too. How do PIs provide oversight for this? And then, on the same hand, how do you go about monitoring that? And I guess maybe tied to this question is how can tools like this maybe, and by this I mean CRIO, help provide some of that oversight and guidance?
Sure, I can start. So, I mean, I really don't see how this is possible without an electronic system at all. With the ability to centrally build the eSource for the protocol and push it out to sites, we're standardizing the template that's used. And then we can have different types of sites, like you're mentioning, Jonathan, with more of a home health nurse style, or if it's a brick and mortar site or whatever it might be, they're receiving the same sort of template, building upon their workflows that are needed per their SOPs. Then we still have that standard template that the CRAs are able to remotely log in and review with those site-specific workflows built in. And then, of course, from for the PI for oversight, being that this is done electronically, they can log in and just review all of that data in one place, utilize some of the functionality that CRIO has, for example, with querying and alerting users of new data, AEs, things like that. And then from the monitoring perspective, of course, just being able to go in and see all of that data for the entire study rolled up and review in real time. So electronic source is really the way to go to ensure that this is even possible.
And I guess kind of coupled with that too, right? You also ensure that kind of consistent data collection.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because I guess in certain circumstances, and Dakota, you may have insight into this, if you're working with a home-based nursing type visit as well as other types of things, you could have differences across the source or what tools those other organizations might be using, but they're all underneath kind of the guise of that PI, and that PI is essentially the one with that oversight. So I guess that's another risk that hopefully can be mitigated or would be mitigated with a tool like you've been talking about here today.
And if I could jump in there as well, I would say, echoing Megan's feedback there, it's impossible to manage that without an eSource solution. Where we've seen it even from the early days just as a site tool. I remember some of the early feedback that I found quite amusing was we had a unique PI and he oversaw multiple sites. He had his own private practice, so the logistics were a bit challenging at time for him to manage the research. So he said his favorite part about CRIO's technology is now for his PI oversight. He was largely doing this after his private practice hours were done, and he was at home on his couch. So it's not necessarily was made for PI oversight from the couch, but it did allow them to participate in a lot of additional trials where they were working with more doctors and types of facilities than they ever had before, because they now had this access point into what was being done at those additional locations that the PI could still sign on even as the visit was being completed, and ensure that these other partners they worked with were completing the protocol as required. And this goes back as well to the timestamps and the audit trails in particular. And this was something that became very evident during COVID, is these home health visits were increasingly more prominent. But they are very challenging from a logistics standpoint of ensuring they're done correctly. You're often leveraging a resource that is not associated with the site. So ensuring that they are trained on the specifics of your protocol is very challenging.
Yeah.
So with an eSource solution, it really mitigates that, where the procedures need to be collected are right there in front of them. It has that real-time data validation that if there are issues with a certain vital sign maybe needing to be repeated, it has that automation to flag that for somebody, that you are less reliant on an individual to understand the intricacies of a protocol, because a lot of that logic is built into the template itself. And also from the compliance standpoint, with those timestamps, on paper, it's impossible to know if we really are completing procedures exactly on the right times. You're very dependent on what you see in front of you. It's also additional work to document that. So with eSource, it removes the dependency on the study coordinator to have to sit and document each time point, and instead just focus on the actual data collection.
Right.
And then the monitoring is very simple.
Yeah, and actually kind of related to that, you mentioned this earlier that, with the use of tools like this and the use of direct eSource data capture, one of the questions that came in here was around diversity, obviously a very important topic. Thankfully, a light has been shown more on it than it has in the past. In fact, FDA produced a guidance document last April, I think it was, on really driving diversity or ensuring diversity is included in your program and your project planning for each of your clinical trials. And you mentioned earlier, Dakota, again, the questions around how do tools like this help drive diversity in clinical trials was the question that came in. But I think more importantly, I think it could be tied back to your earlier statements around that tools like this free up sites from having to do as much administrative activities and allow them to really focus on enrollment and recruitment and things like that. So curious to get, I think we'll start with you, Dakota, and then Megan add in as well. But how does this approach also help what I love to call kind of push forward a diversity-driven clinical trial approach?
Yeah, it really does empower it. So the issue with diversity inclusion in clinical trials is widely known, and it's finally getting a lot of discussion around it. But there are limited solutions to improving it, where everybody wants more diversity from an ethical and scientific rationale. But the issue is you need to go where these patients are. So as industry, we are so reliant on the same set of sites, which see the same type of patients, that really, to me, what CRIO enables us to do is identify a potential site that maybe isn't as strong of a research background, that maybe doesn't have that experience, but they are set in the location of where these patients are. And we know with the template we're able to provide them and the additional guidance that should be expected to come from a CRO, that the site can still perform at a high quality, but also help to reach those diversity goals.
So essentially really allowing you to work with maybe more clinical research naive sites by having tools like this that help enforce an approach and process that can be centrally managed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Megan, if you have anything further to add to that.
Yeah, I certainly echo what Dakota said, but with an eSource solution like CRIO that is truly built for the sites, and that was how CRIO was initially founded, we're able to help assist with providing these templates that really do help with the site workflows, and they identify any of the out of range values or alerts or things up front, and with ease of use, it just allows for, like Dakota said, some of those perhaps research naive sites to participate in these trials. So we try to provide them with the support and the tools that will enable them to succeed. And of course, with electronic data capture, we also are able to standardize some of this data, report on it more efficiently, and just continue to increase our diversity in the trials moving forward.
Thank you both.
All right, and it looks like we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So I will ask this one that just came through. Is there a risk or any mitigations to being too narrowly focused on the data to be collected or being collected? They provided a couple more thoughts. They said that they're thinking if site personnel are only creating source that fits the EDC rather than pulling data from an independently conducted comprehensive visit for a subject. Can you speak to that, Dakota or Megan?
I think what the question is driving towards is, so often we've seen that a site creates their source just based on the small set of data points required for the EDC for that visit. So what's unique about this approach of using CRIO is now we're able to provide them a template that is much more all-encompassing of potential outcomes at that patient visit, but it still provides the site and the PI the ownership that they're able to add on to that. So there's different regional criteria. A site may have a local IRB that uses slightly different procedures, that they retain that ownership to add additional fields and to create a set of information that they feel is complete. And now it's a true collaboration between the site, the sponsor, and the CRO managing the trial, that it doesn't have that limitation of, well, from a statistical standpoint, here's the small set of information we care about. So please start there, and then anything beyond that hasn't been a focus. So it is a much more all-encompassing approach.
Thanks, Dakota. All right, well, unfortunately, that is about all the time we have for today's Q&A session. So just wanted to thank everyone who submitted their questions. And this week, you will receive a short survey where you'll have the opportunity to submit any remaining questions that we didn't have time to answer today, as well as provide some feedback and suggestions for our future webinars and events. And I'd like to thank our presenters, Dakota and Megan, again for their informative presentation, and also thank Jonathan for helping facilitate the Q&A discussion. And thank you all for attending, and I hope that everyone has a great day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.